Hello everyone, we're here in TESOL Colombia 3, and here with us we have James Stubbs.
Hello.
And our presenter on reducing foreign language anxiety. James, can you tell us about what made you interested in this topic?
Okay, I think there were two moments. One was as a language learner. I started having Spanish classes when I came to Colombia, and my focus was obviously trying to communicate with people out of necessity. But my teacher's focus was on correcting the conjugation of verbs. And I think she once told me, one teacher, in Colombia we say that when you make an error like that, you speak like Tarzan. I thought, why did she tell me that? Why? What's that going to achieve? And so then later, as I became more interested in linguistics and how languages are learned, there were like moments as I learned about the last sort of 40 years of language acquisition research, as I learned about the difference between developing implicit and explicit knowledge, where I thought, hold on a minute, why is everyone obsessing all the time about errors, and why? This is obviously making people anxious. There are obviously anxious students with regards to language everywhere. And so I thought, right, this is going to be the topic that I, for now, look into with some sort of profundity.
All right, that sounds very interesting. Now, who do you think will be more responsible for language learning anxiety? Language teachers or students themselves?
I think the whole idea, look, students are not aware of progress in language learning. That as much as people go on about like, oh yeah, but task-based learning, it's all been done, clearly it's all been done. It hasn't, because students don't know about it. And if it had been done, they'd know about it. And so I think that this whole idea that surrounds language learning, that languages are learned when you perfect one sort of type of expression, the there is, there are, or the present simple, and then you move on to the next and you perfect that, and that this is how you learn languages, and that there's a big basis on accuracy. I'd say that whole thing around it, because students sometimes don't help themselves. They'll go and complain about a teacher who doesn't correct them, or they'll insist on things being done in a way that they find familiar. But teachers also don't help sometimes, no? They insist on persisting with this PPP methodology that involves them sort of correcting publicly errors and students demonstrating their knowledge of grammar. And the only reason that people speak is to like demonstrate what they know, but not to express an idea. All of that encapsulates, it sort of encourages it, but also, you're incredibly vulnerable, aren't you? Okay. When you're having to express yourself in a language you partially know, you are incredibly vulnerable, and that needs to be taken into account too.
In your presentation, you talked about one aspect that has to do with unfavorable comparisons. Can you tell us a bit more about it?
Yeah, I think like as a society, like if we talk in general, if we spoke to people who suffer from anxiety, what you'd find, and this is from my discussions with a psychologist, I just invent this, is that people who are anxious believe that they're being evaluated all the time. Yeah, that's why they're anxious, because there's someone over there. They could be outside going about their business, buying their food, but they think someone's evaluating them. It's the same with language learners who are anxious. Yeah, they believe that all these other people in the class are making comparisons and evaluating them. So yeah, that's all. That's what that is, and it's a key aspect of any type of anxiety.
The aspect that you highlighted the most in your presentation had to do with perfectionism. Yeah. Can you tell us about it and perhaps the results you may have?
So what I found in the sort of few studies that I've done and in my reading, you don't reduce language anxiety unless you reduce perfectionism. So it's key. Perfectionism is this idea that when I speak, I have to speak perfectly and not make any errors. Now, unless you tackle that, now a lot of current practice doesn't only not tackle it, it promotes it. Unless you tackle that, you will never resolve this issue that many students have with regards to being anxious. And like, it is very almost impossible because of like how anxiety affects the language acquisition process to learn a language when you are suffering from language anxiety. So unless you reduce perfectionism, you're not going to see language learning, in my opinion.
Now, if I'm a learner and I want to speak the language well, and that prevents me from learning the language properly, what would you suggest?
Change your focus. Why did you want to learn this language in the first place? So you could demonstrate your brilliance in the past continuous? No, you didn't even know what that was. Yeah? You wanted to communicate with people. And that's what you need to make. It's like the guy yesterday was talking about, yeah? Setting goals. Yeah? Your goal was communication. And that's what you need to remember again. It doesn't matter that other people are constantly going on about the difference between there is and there are and the verb to be and all of these other things, yeah? That's not how languages are learned, yeah? That people have known that for the last 40 years of acquisition research. What you need to focus on is communicating meaning. And if you are not being given opportunities to communicate meaning and the meaning of what you're saying is not being valued, then you need to think about learning somewhere else.
Okay, all right. Now, towards the end of the presentation, you also told us about the importance of discussing the issue with students. How's that?
Well, what I found was that the people hadn't heard of it. So if you are blighted by something, yeah, and you become totally nervous and you're like, what is this? Why am I so terrified of the English language? And you cannot put your finger on what it is, then you're never going to improve this situation. So the first thing is to introduce it. The second thing is to discuss ideas around language learning. Why do students have to know exactly how you make the third conditional, like being able to recite it, but they're not allowed any access to the world of how languages are learned? This to me seems absolutely ludicrous. So giving them that knowledge and allowing them to reflect on how languages are learned and discuss it and become, don't expect people to be autonomous learners if you're just going to send them off to conjugate verbs or something. If you give them the tools to know how things are done and so that they can experiment with different things and talk about it with their colleagues, then I think you will almost definitely reduce their perfectionism and their language anxiety.
Okay. Now, we also discussed earlier that perhaps teachers are also responsible for this language anxiety in our learners, perhaps due to overcorrection.
I think, what correction is one thing, no? Yeah, one of the things that the students said to me, and this was in, I think, the first support group we did, what don't you like? I don't like it when people humiliate me. And that's their words, not mine, humiliate me, which is their term for being corrected in front of the whole class. Okay. So that is obviously a difficult thing, but also it's what you prioritise, isn't it? If you prioritise accuracy and you prioritise this behaviourist view of language learning, that language has to be learned, this part needs to be perfected, then this part needs to be perfected, and then you go from there is, there are, and you go to this, and you go to that, and you go to that, and they all need to be perfected in a certain order that someone who wrote a book has decided, then that's going to make people anxious because they think they have to do things absolutely correctly. But if you prioritise input, and the ability to communicate and negotiate meaning with other people trying to communicate meaning, then you will create a lower anxiety classroom, and almost certainly there will be more language acquisition learning, whatever term you want to use.
Now, just to close, what would be your recommendation for the ELT community to help reduce language learning anxiety?
Okay, maybe I've got a bit too much interchanging practice. I've focused myself on language anxiety. My 3 tips were: discuss it, make sure that everything is open, make sure students are aware of the language learning process, make sure they're aware of language anxiety. 2, really think about making corrections, especially in front of the whole class. What's it going to achieve? How much is it involved in, how much of their interlanguage will it change? And how much embarrassment will it cause them? Sort of weigh these things off. And the other thing is, let people. What I wanted to do when I first started learning Spanish was talk to people and communicate my ideas to people who didn't speak English. That's why I was learning Spanish. Yeah, I frankly didn't care about people's comments about conjugating verbs like Tarzan. I wanted to communicate. Let students communicate.
Okay, well, I hope that everyone keeps these tips in mind. And we know the topic has been around for quite a long time, but there's still a lot to learn. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Thanks.